Hello. All right, I am live. We're just going to finish up the video, okay? So, no guests tonight. Just going to finish up the debate, and then you'll get my notes, and then I'll do that, and then I'll work on that speech for you. All right, here we go.
You've been a wonderfully polite audience. I would ask you to please continue that. I must say, I really enjoyed this so far, so let's have questions. We'll start the first question for Dr. Erhman. The way we'll do it is we'll let Dr. Erhman answer. Jimmy wants to make a comment, that's fine. And if Dr. Erhman, each one will get to wrap up, and then we'll go to the next question. Hello, sir.
Hello. My name's Lenny. Dr. Erhman, I have a question. You've heard a lot of the gospel tonight. What I'm curious about is, in terms of the historicity of these events, what impact does the oral tradition when these events took place, when the events were first put pen to paper, and then when our earliest copies of these documents exist? So just hoping you could maybe comment on, and what I'm curious about is, in terms of the historicity of these events, what impact does the oral tradition when these events took place, when the events were first put pen to paper, and then when our earliest copies of these documents exist? So just hoping you could maybe comment on how that relates to how much we can trust these from a historical point of view.
Yeah, it's a great question about the oral tradition. I wrote a book about this.
I want to hear the question again.
How that our earliest copies of these documents were first put when these events. What impact does the oral tradition?
What impact does the oral tradition
took place
from when these events took place?
When the events were first put pen to paper.
Compared to when the events were first put pen to paper.
Our earliest copies of these documents exist.
Then when our earliest copies exist.
So just hoping you could maybe comment on how that relates to how much we can trust these from a historical.
And the question is, how much does that relate to how much can we trust
Point of view.
Yeah, it's a
the historical point of view of these documents? Let me think. So, I would say that when compared to other classics, it doesn't hurt much. When you're looking at it as a standalone book, and you're trying to make it fit what we can find in actual history, I think the distance from our earliest copies to when the story was first spoken, even if you want to say the story was first spoken by the apostles, making the original telling of the scriptures and the story of Jesus within maybe even within a year of his death. I'm not talking about the first writings. I'm talking about the oral tradition. You have it happening right after Pentecost. You have people going to different lands 2 by 2. Most of these people either get wiped out or those churches don't last. So a lot of the story gets spread out, but then it doesn't really go anywhere. You only have a few that make it. Then at some point, people start dying out, so they decide to write it down. And by now, it's changed from the Aramaic to Koine Greek. You figure 4 churches, maybe. Survive that. And that becomes the Patriarchate. That becomes the 5 main churches. Let's see. Each culture would have changed the wording by a lot. The phrasing, the order of events. I think you can still use it to find historical facts. But I think it's really hard to prove that the words are the actual words that the person said, because you're going through not just translation, not just transmission, not just a different mode of transmission. So you got multiple layers of change happening. But I look at something like W.H.D. Rouse version of the Iliad or the Odyssey. And it matches really close to the Fraggle. So Robert Fraggle's version is the standard version, and it's boring, it's dry, it's not entertaining. I don't like it. I love W.H.D. Rowe's version. And W.H.D. Rowe's, the way that he got his stories, he simply went to Greece and listened to sailors and fishermen sing their version, their modern version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, that might be romanticized, writers lie, but at least according to his introduction to his books, that's what he did. And it's pretty close, and that's thousands of years apart from the original telling, multiple thousands of years, like at least 3,000 years apart, and they're still telling a fairly accurate rendition of those stories. So, do I think there's narrative drift that happens through that kind of transmission? I would say yes. But I would say it does not negate the reliability of the text. It just means that the version of the text that we are using now, which is supposedly based on earlier and earlier texts that we find, is locked in to whenever that oldest parchment is found. So your reliability is locked into the earliest version that we have. And it doesn't mean that the earliest version that we have is the most accurate version. It's just the oldest version we have. That would be my opinion.
Great. It's a great question about the oral tradition. I wrote a book about this a few years ago called Jesus Before the Gospels, dealing with how oral tradition works. And I really loved writing this book because I spent about 2 years not reading anything involved with the New Testament or early Christianity. I spent 2 years reading
that would be my opinion.
Studies of memory, psychological studies of memory, sociology of memory, anthropological studies of oral cultures, to try and figure out how oral cultures pass on their traditions, because all of us have grown up thinking or hearing that these oral cultures told things accurately, they didn't change things, they made sure they couldn't change things because they couldn't check with writing, so they kept it all right. And it turns out that's just not right. It's not right. And so the gospel traditions, when Mark writes his gospel, I think Mark was the first gospel. It's generally conceded. Mark was the first gospel written around the year 70 or so. That means that he's writing it in Greek. He doesn't live in Israel. And so stories have been circulating for 40 years when he writes it down. He might have had earlier written sources. He doesn't say he did. But sources that circulate for 40 years in oral cultures, they change a lot. And they just do. And so Mark is recording. And so that's why it's so difficult to know whether so much of this is actually historical, because it's so much later. And it's based on a story that one person tells another, tells another, tells another.
Here's my question, and I'm not so much worried about Mark, but I'm wondering, does Bart or any of the other scholars who are concentrating on the literature acknowledge that there are other, let's call them streams of oral transmission of these stories than just the one that ended up in Mark? Do they acknowledge the other schools? Do they acknowledge a Petrine school and a Johannian school and a Lucian school for these traditions that might be different churches than whatever church developed the Marcion account? That's my question for the scholars right now.
For decades, and these people who are telling these stories were not the people who were there. And so it's like, it makes it complicated. I think that does complicate the matter. It doesn't mean that they're all completely inaccurate, as Jimmy's pointed out. I think a lot of things are probably accurate, but it takes a lot of work to show it. Our earliest manuscripts themselves are, for the Gospels, that's another problem. It's an unrelated problem. But for Mark's Gospel, for example, if Mark was written around the year 70, the first fragmentary Gospel Mark that we have is from about 130 years later, the first copy that we have. So it's copied and copied and copied and copied, and it was, scribes changed things. The first complete copy we have of Mark is in the 4th century, 370 years later. So the first complete copy is 300 years of handwritten copies. And so that's also another problem. It's a different problem.
Okay. So
I think that was a fair answer.
Bart's just alluded to tradents, that's the fancy word for people who pass on a tradition, to tradents going one after another, after another, after another for decades. Now, I don't actually think that the Gospels were written as long after the events as Bart does, and that's okay. What many people have compared this process of passing on tradition to is the telephone game, where, kids in school, one of them will start with a message and then they whisper it to the next kid and they keep whispering it down the line. And by the end of the line, you get something that's hilarious and totally unrelated to the original. And one of the problems with analogizing the gospel tradition to the telephone game is you're talking about kids. Of course they're going to screw it up. They're going to screw it up on purpose just for laughs. So what about people who believe that Jesus is God and they are taking their souls in their hands and need to preserve this tradition accurately for the sake of the souls they're ministering to and for the sake of their own souls? I think that might have an effect. Now, it's not going to be, you're going to get some variation, but the studies in tradition that Bart's referring to will admit that the gist is much more accurately preserved than the individual wording, than paraphrase, for example. On the other hand, this is an empirical question, and I said, let's test it. So I've actually been conducting the gospel telephone experiment.
So it's very interesting. Jimmy does a lot of his own research and his own studies. I don't think he publishes any of it, which is sad. And it'd be interesting to see how much his methods hold up to peer review. But, or maybe if he does publish it, it's under a pseudonym. But yeah, Jimmy's weird enough and popular enough that he can do these kind of experiments. So kudos to him, I guess.
Experiment where I took various traditions from apocryphal gospels, so they would not be ones that are familiar to the people hearing them, but they're like a story of Jesus, a saying of Jesus, and so forth. And I've gone to people and said, call this telephone number and leave the message with the tradition you were assigned. And then I'll take that recording and give it to a new person, and thus I'll create this chain of people who are motivated Christians who are trying to take this seriously and preserve the gist of their tradition. I wanted to have the results to announce to you tonight, but the experiment's taken longer than planned. But what I can say is so far, they're pretty darn good at passing on the gist. The gist has not altered. I also would disagree with Bart that the Gospels are the result of a telephone game. John's Gospel claims to be written, not necessarily, I mean, I'm sure he had a scribe, but claims to be written by an eyewitness, the beloved disciple. He says it flat out.
Where?
Next to last verse in John 21. He says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written them.
Yes. He's basing it on a source.
Let's all enjoy the wonderfulness of this commercial. I'm sure this actor is paid very well to pretend to be a NASA museum curator. I'm hoping that this man has good insurance. Oh, he's not a NASA. He's an UTRGV. That's great. So he's not even a good actor. I feel bad for him. I don't think those glasses fit his face, and he's losing his hair, and I know how terrible that could be. He's also overweight, so I'm kind of worried about his health. I also feel that he shouldn't be filming his students. I mean, that's just kind of inappropriate. Also, I don't think that that's functional, nor is that. I don't think that actually works. I don't think it has strings. This is a very devastating commercial. You know, let's just put the guy. Let's just skip this because I feel bad for this man.
No.
Witness to these things, and who has written them.
Yes. He's basing it on a source.
So the scribe is speaking on
No. The author of John is basing it on a source. In John 19:35, he says, the wound of the side, that the disciple Jesus loved has borne witness to this, and we know that the testimony is true.
Yeah.
Which means that's not him. He did this.
There is significant scholarly debate on that point. But I think John is
A scholarly debate, the debate between apologists and secular scholars. Now, when you both have doctorates in Bibleology, let's say one has whatever secular scholarship, they're majoring in Hebrew or Bible studies or something, and they got down to like one specific thing, and then you have apologists who have a doctorate in theology or religion, slightly broader, general. Plus, they have their DVA or their MVid or something, you know, or they went to seminary at either a Catholic school or a Protestant one. I wonder if the two departments are headed by the same department head. So the person who's the school that's teaching apologetics and hermeneutics, and the school that's teaching, let's say, biblical criticism and I don't know, pick your poison. I wonder if it's the same head. I wonder if it's the same department head, if it's the same college. You know what I mean? Or if it's two different colleges, two different schools, but there's one department head. I wonder about these things. These are things that I care about. I don't think anybody else does.
It's very close to the original source. Even if you want to say it's one link further, fine. It's still not.
Oh, no, it's
30.
not one link later. It's 60 years later.
I'm talking in terms of links of tradition. And it
If anybody
claims
wants
to
to
be
know
based.
about it, if you look at my book, I have a long list of studies of the kind of thing you're talking about. And it's pretty clear how it happens.
In any event, I don't think the Gospels are the product of telephone games. I think, according to the traditional account that is agreed with by many scholars, Mark is based on Peter.
I also want them both to stop saying many scholars. Just name the scholar. Name one. I mean, I at least will mention which book I use. Mention the scholar.
Luke is based on a variety of sources, including Peter and Mark. And John is based on an eyewitness. And Matthew, if he's Matthew, would be an eyewitness. So I don't think there's a long link.
Well,
But
I know lots of historical scholars. I don't know anybody who agrees with that. It's the traditional view. But okay, yeah, we need more.
Balcom.
Okay, lots of.
Next question is for Jimmy Akin.
I like how both of them mention scholars that the other guy just doesn't care for.
Thank you both for an interesting evening. My question has to do with a topic you spoke on, which is multiple attestation. In Matthew 27:53, it basically describes the zombie apocalypse after Jesus' death, right? We have people coming out of the grave, they appear, we have darkness that comes over the land, we have a giant earthquake that shakes the earth. My question basically is, why do we not have any third-party attestation of this outside the Bible? Why is that?
well, according you do so. The overall experience is reported in now the raised dead, who are not accurately described as zombies, because zombies is someone who comes back damaged, as opposed to someone God has raised. Yeah, they are mentioned, and they're only mentioned in Matthew. The other aspects of the experience, like the earthquake and the darkness, those are mentioned more broadly in the Gospels. And we do have early Christian sources that mention various aspects of them, but you could, of course, argue, well, they're just getting them from the Gospels, so that's inconclusive. There have been recent claims that and I haven't had a chance to investigate these yet, so I can't vouch for this, but there are recent claims of dating a particular earthquake to this time period that may be the one that's being referred to in the Gospels. I don't know if that's true or not, But these events were occurring in a place where they were of significance primarily to Jesus' followers. And so it's that community that preserved the memory of them. People outside of Jerusalem wouldn't have experienced them. They wouldn't preserve the memory of them. And people who were opposed to Jesus and his message, they would have no interest in preserving them because they would tend to validate the Christian message. So of course they're not going to mention them.
I'm not as impressed with that answer as I was with Bart's. Even if I think those same words would come out of my mouth if someone had asked me that in that situation, I think I would say the same thing that Jimmy said. I just don't think it's a good answer.
No. I think it was a sandstorm. The sun just gets blocked out. There are sandstorms like this all the time. Yeah, I think it was a local darkness. It was an atmospheric phenomenon. I mean, it didn't have to be sand. It could just be thick clouds. But I think it was a local phenomenon.
Also, I don't know why it can't just be literary, not trope, literary style. You know, as the writer, you can do literary expression. You can say my heart was torn in two. It doesn't mean your heart was actually ripped apart. You could say, you know, after this happened, the moon shattered and whatever else. It can just, it can just be literary style.
We know, the one thing we know is it was not an eclipse because it occurred at Passover and the moon's in the wrong position for an eclipse at Passover.
Yeah, I don't have anything to respond to that.
Dr. Erhman, you noted how, for example, in Matthew, Jesus did not speak of his divinity. Question, would it be fair to say that Jesus demonstrated his divinity by his actions for people familiar with the attributes of God in the Old Testament? For example, forgiving the paralytic sins, walking on water, or calming the storm. These events were mentioned in Matthew chapters 9.
I mean, the problem is that Bart Erhman doesn't believe in miracles, so I'm sure he's going to say it's literary expression or hyperbole or just made up fiction. Let's see. I don't remember his answer.
And 14.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. Thank you. What I would say is that in the Bible, people who are empowered by God are given the ability to do these things. In the Old Testament, you have people who are doing all sorts of miracles that only God can do because God empowers them. In Jesus' time, forgiveness of sins was something that priests in the temple would do. When there was a sacrifice, the priest would pronounce a person's sins forgiven. So when Jesus pronounces sins forgiven, what he's doing is not claiming to be God. He's claiming to have the power of the priest, that now the Son of God can forgive sins. And so I don't think that I think that Matthew does think that Jesus is a divine being. I think that he does understand Jesus as the Son of God. I think that's right. My point is that Jesus does not claim equality with God in any of these other Gospels or the sources, except our very last one. And you know, I've been influenced heavily by Raymond Brown, whose book on the community of the beloved disciple argues that this is a later development within Christianity where people started thinking of Jesus in more exalted terms because of things that were happening within their community. And I find that very convincing. But I do think that Matthew certainly thinks Jesus could do miracles, but I don't think miracle working makes a person God.
And I would agree, just because someone does miracles like walking on water doesn't mean that they're automatically God. I also recognize the distinction that Bart is making between the disciples believing that Jesus was God, which I think happened very early on, and Jesus himself claiming to be God. Mm-hmm. Where I would disagree is I think in the synoptics we actually do have indications that Jesus regarded himself as divine. He doesn't preach it openly because he'd get stoned, duh. And when he does mention it, even there indirectly in John, in public, they recognize what he's saying and they pick up stones to stone him. So yeah, he was on the down low about
Bart has a slightly different explanation of that situation. I know I've heard him explain it twice on, I believe, Digital Hammurabi, or maybe on one of his other podcasts. But he has a different explanation of that than Jimmy Akin. But I think Bart Ehrman's explanation, though, is different than the other dark magisterium types. So,
the I'm God thing. But he does indicate that he's the Son of God, and he is thus equal to the Father in divinity.
I think Bart would argue that the writer indicates that he's the Son of God. But I don't know, there's some play there, because I think he would say something like, any outside of John, you don't really see that. You don't really see the identification with God. Son of God is a little different. Son of Man is a little different. I do believe it's parsing hairs. To me, they're definitive statements. To most Christians, I know they're definitive statements. But I know that Bart doesn't think that they are. He has caveats to them.
The same way, Bart, you have a son, right?
I'm not anywhere nearly as great as he.
Well,
the first time I watched this, I was a little uncomfortable when Jimmy Akin brought up Bart Ehrman's son. Bart Ehrman seems very private with his personal life and with his family, and I thought it was a little uncalled for. Watching it the second time, it doesn't seem as offensive, but it's still a weird. It's an unexpected swing.
but you have a son. Your son shares your nature as a human being, and so in that sense, you're equal, even though in a patriarchal society, you would outrank your son.
Yeah, no, that in our society, that's the way we look at it. Of course, in ancient Israel, the Son of God, the first one explicitly called the Son of God is Solomon in 2 Samuel 7:14. And so I don't think that Solomon was of the same essence as the Father.
No, I recognize the term Son of God has multiple meanings, but Jesus claimed to it was unique. And one place that we see that is in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus is so the very first Gospel, Jesus is on trial before the high priest. The high priest says, "Tell us, are you the Son of the Blessed or not?" And Jesus agrees obliquely and says, "And from now on, you shall see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven," which is a reference to Daniel 7. Now, the high priest then says, "You have heard the blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses?" So the high priest regarded this statement as blasphemy, which is a direct offense against God in speech. Well, claiming to be the Messiah was not blasphemy. Claiming to be the Son of God in a Solomonic sense is not blasphemy. So why does he regard it as blasphemy? It's because of the reference to Daniel about you shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven to be enthroned with God. That's what's happening in that passage.
I would love to have a Jewish rabbi or Jewish scholar tell me how that line is taken within Judaism, and if it would be offensive for a Christian to make that reference in referring to themselves, or referring to a president or a king or a great warrior or a great preacher. Would that be offensive?
Passage. And in Second Temple Judaism, which is when we are, there was a controversy about what is now in the scholarly community referred to as the two powers in heaven doctrine, where Jewish people had been looking at passages in the Old Testament that seem to imply, yeah, there's this Yahweh in heaven, but there's this other divine figure too, who's sometimes called the second Yahweh. And Daniel 7 was one of those passages. And so it was recognized that Yahweh is enthroned, and then next to him, the second Yahweh is enthroned, according to two powers in heaven theorists. And so by saying, I'm that Son of Man who you're going to see enthroned in heaven, Jesus is claiming to be God, and that's why the high priest and the others regard it as blasphemy.
Dr. Erhman, the question was for you, so.
I would just say that certainly would be convincing if what Jesus said was, I am the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, in his reply to the high priest in Mark 14:62. It's not what he says. He says, you will see the Son of Man. There's no indication in the passage he's talking about himself. Jesus in the Gospels talks about the Son of Man, but it's, so anyway, this one could go on all night because there are people who've written very big books about the Son of Man.
Yeah. I think next question is for Jimmy Akin over here.
Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. My question might be a little bit off topic, but do you personally subscribe to Markan or Matthean priority? And what are your own views on Q's source material? Do you think its existence strengthens or weakens the case for reliability? Also, if you have time to comment, what do you think of the work of modern defenders of the Hebrew gospel hypothesis, like James R. Edwards?
So let's see if I can address those expeditiously. I do believe that Mark was the first gospel to be written, and I'm not beholden for my views to any particular school of thought. I've entertained them all, I've read their arguments, but after reviewing ancient compositional practices, Mark does not make any sense if it's not the first. And I actually have on jimmyakin.com a whole section of papers I've written about the synoptic problem, and I go through the evidence for why I think Mark is first. Q which is the supposed source behind about 235 verses that Matthew and Luke have in common, is a more complicated subject. And I don't have settled 100% views on this. I'm still open to various arguments, but I lean towards a view that's called the Wilke hypothesis, which involves not Matthean or Matthew coming first, not Matthean priority, but Matthean posteriority. So at least the view I lean towards is Mark wrote first, Luke supplemented Mark, and then Matthew used Mark and Luke. And if you have that as the paradigm, then you don't need to posit an independent Q source. Those 235 verses could have been taken and adapted from Luke. And so I tend to view Q as really just a part of Luke. At least that's the way I lean. The third question you asked about was defenders of the idea of a Hebrew gospel, and I assume you're referring to the claim that Matthew wrote a Hebrew gospel. We obviously know there were Hebrew gospels that were used in Jewish Christian communities, but there's a claim that Matthew originally wrote his in Hebrew and then it got translated into Greek. I don't tend to favor that view. I think there are other ways to explain that passage. At least based on the current state of my research, I would say that Matthew wrote in Greek, but he wrote in a Jewish style because that was his primary audience, and I think that's really what's being said in that passage.
Dr. Erhman, yeah, and then
I
we'll
don't
just
need
go
to reply, that's fine, yeah.
That's okay. So the next question is for Dr. Erhman.
Hi.
I'm actually a little disappointed there. I really wanted Bart Erhman. I really wanted Bart Erhman to answer that, but I think he's already tired of Jimmy's BS, and I think he just wants to be done with it, which is too bad because I think Bart could have answered that very well.
So at some point, Jimmy said that the gospel authors were intending to write historically accurate accounts. I was curious if you agree that that's what they were intending to do, or if you think they had some other intention, maybe in addition, and therefore maybe if you think some of the stories were actually intentionally fabricated for some purpose versus being mistaken like a game of telephone.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that I think it's a complicated question because the Gospels, I think the Gospel writers don't have our sense of historical reliability and historicity. I think it's quite clear that the Gospels are changing things so that Jimmy, I agree with Jimmy that Mark was the first Gospel and Matthew changed things. He changes things in ways that make it incommensurate with Mark. That shows that he's probably not just concerned about getting the historical details right. He's trying to convey a message. And I think when you read the Gospels, the mistake is thinking in modern 21st century terms about how somebody records a biography. We think they've got to be accurate, and that's what really matters. Well, these authors didn't have 21st century understandings of history and historiography and biography. They don't call themselves histories. Mark introduces his book by saying it's a gospel. The word gospel in Greek, it's euangelion. It means preaching the good news. So his interest is proclamation. It's not recording history. And so, no, I don't think that they thought they were recording history the way we think of it. Even Luke, who's sometimes read that way because of his prologue, I don't think any of them are doing that. I think they're quite clearly trying to preach a message, a Christian message to their Christian congregation about the significance of Jesus as they understand.
I agree with everything that Bart Erhman just said.
I would agree with all that. I would just say that I think they are concerned about getting the historical gist correct, and I think they do.
I think we are at time.
I think they had the clock set for 20 minutes,
So there's
and
10
then
more
it
minutes?
ran down, and they've now reset it for 10, but I could be mistaken.
I thought it was 2. Yeah, I don't know.
I really don't want to keep anybody longer than we said we were going to keep him. Does anybody keep the time on that? What's that? It was 20, so we have 10 more?
Yeah,
Is that okay with both of you?
I think that's what we were doing.
That's what we agreed, yeah.
Okay.
So bring it on.
All right, 10 more minutes. This question's for Jimmy Akin. I apologize for that.
No, I think,
It was
yeah,
the
that's
clock setting.
yeah.
Hi, my question has to do with the supernatural claims of the Gospels. And I like how you brought up Lincoln and his accounts, because there are actual books written about Lincoln being a vampire hunter or a vampire slayer.
Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, I know.
Exactly, yeah.
Also check
And-
out Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Exactly, another one too, yeah. But my question has to do with, you also accept other historical supernatural claims brought up by these, and if you do not, then why do you accept supernatural claims brought up by the Bible?
So
Good and fair question.
I have a supernatural worldview, and my worldview actually, certainly in this respect, is very similar to the worldview of both the Israelites in the Old Testament and the Christians in the New Testament. They didn't assume that only we have supernatural things happening. They would, in fact, assume that other groups of people did have miracles occurring in their community. And these miracles could be due to God having mercy on these people, or they could be due to fallen angels tricking people, or some of them would be hoaxes, but the genuine ones didn't have to be just for us. Jesus himself talks about this when he is discussing exorcism. And he's been accused of exorcising demons by the power of the devil. And he says, well, if that's how I'm doing it, how are your sons doing it? So Jesus acknowledges that there were Jewish people who were driving out demons. So you didn't have to be a member of the Christian community for God to do something supernatural through you. And so I would say that I have to take supernatural accounts reported outside the Christian community seriously. I was listening to a discussion that Bart Erhman had with, I believe it was Tim McGrew, a Protestant philosopher and apologist, and the Baal Shem Tov came up. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Jewish Hasidism, and Bart correctly pointed out that a lot of miracles were attributed to the Baal Shem Tov very early and by people who knew him, and they're all documented very early. And Bart's question for Tim McGrew was, well, why would you take these seriously? And McGrew tried to backpedal a little bit, but I wouldn't. I'd say I'd have to look at the evidence. I haven't had a chance to look in detail at the claims about Baal Shem Tov's miracles, but I would look at them open-mindedly because God does do miracles outside the Christian community, and I have to be open to that.
I know Jimmy's still going, but I agree with this answer as well. Mind you, I'm a bit more skeptical on things like witchcraft and ghosts. I doesn't mean that I don't believe that ghosts aren't possible. I just don't believe that anything in entertainment, as entertainment describes things, is true. So I don't, if there are witches, they're definitely not what's on TV. If there is magic, it's not what's seen on, I don't know, pick something, Doctor Strange. Like, that's just not real magic. And I don't believe in real magic anyway. So yeah, I mean, is it possible there's miracles in other cultures? Definitely. Is there supernatural or metaphysical or metanatural or supranatural events? Sure. Does that mean that every claim is true? Definitely not. And does that mean that only Christians can do miracles? No. Jesus acknowledges other cultures. Amazing things happen all over the world. So, yeah, I agree with Jimmy here. Although my worldview on the supernatural might be less colorful than his.
But then there's a sub-question of, well, why be a Christian if there are other miracles? Answer, because, in short form, because God has given us bigger and better miracles like the resurrection of Jesus, and there are a whole bunch of fulfilled prophecies and things like that. So I think even though there are miracles, supernatural acts, occurring outside of the Christian community, the evidence still points to Christianity as the correct understanding of the supernatural world.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's fine.
I'm really bothered that Bart won't answer any of the questions directed to Jimmy. And then Jimmy steps all over Bart's answers. I really want Bart to answer some of this more supernatural stuff.
So my question would be in relation to the crucifixion accounts that were brought up earlier. So earlier we were saying that if we don't look at them side by side and they comparatively match up, then we have to conclude that there's inconsistencies and therefore unreliable. So in Mark we see Jesus silent. Luke, he's speaking. In Mark we have him saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which Jimmy concluded earlier, reference to Psalm 22, which Jews of the time would have known, like we know the Our Father. I imagine they would have known the whole thing, at least a devout Jew. And then in Luke, we have him, in both accounts, we have the veil tearing. And in both accounts, we have the ultimate message being received that Jesus is the Son of God. So Mark, predominantly Jewish audience, Luke, predominantly Gentile audience. We would have to take those audiences into account across the rest of the gospel, which
I think it's taking too long with this question.
some would say would justify those small inconsistencies, which ultimately convey the same message across the gospels. So from a skeptic's perspective, my question is why isn't the skeptic's perspective taking the audience intended that is receiving the message?
I mean, I think it's because we think that, I'm not a fucking skeptic. I think that skeptics and atheists think that it's speaking to a different audience. I think that Christians and Catholics in general think that these original stories were speaking to a Jewish audience, and I think that the skeptics think it was speaking to a later Greek Christian audience. I think our difference in the opinion of dating creates a different audience and creates a barrier to interpretation for the skeptic. Because the skeptics, in their own mind, don't accept inspiration, and from what I've been seeing, they don't like typology.
More into account?
Oh, thank you, it's a good question. And my view is that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm taking the audience into account. If we were trying to ask what message was each one trying to convey to its audience, the audience is everything. If we're trying to ask, is this what happened? That's a different question. For example, if I address all of you as a Catholic audience and I phrase things one way that, for example, that I say, I think the Catholic tradition is just, it's the best tradition that in Christianity, it's an ancient tradition, it goes back, and these Protestants, they're just trying to go back to the Bible and they're ignoring their tradition. If I say that here, and then I go to an evangelical audience and I say, I really think you have the best tradition in Christianity because you're ignoring all of this nonsense that was going through the Middle Ages, and now you get back to the Bible and you're getting back to Jesus. So I'm addressing different things to different audiences. So the question is, what do I think? And so the audience does matter, but the audience is precisely the reason these things get changed so that they're no longer accurate, historically accurate. I'm not saying they're not religiously accurate, but historically you can't have, when they're at odds because of the audience.
I'd agree, except I think it's matters of selection and emphasis, so I don't think they're fundamentally different.
I wish, again, and now I'm beating a dead horse, that Jimmy Akin had opened with that there are differences of selection and emphasis. I wish he had opened up with the just explanation and the telescoping explanation and the paraphrasing explanation and with a definition of what Catholics mean by inspired. And yeah, I really do think that would have been a better debate.
Thank you. Next question for Jimmy.
Okay, so our question was that basically, if Luke used as his primary source Mary, the mother of Jesus, then that wouldn't that be the most reliable out of all the Gospels? So why are the other Gospels taken into account if technically Mary was like the son? I mean, the mother of Jesus. So
well, I guess I'd say a
so
few
how come,
things.
like, why do we account that either he was born in Bethlehem or Nazareth, and in Luke it says one way, so, and that was by Mary, so.
Okay, so
I love Bart's expression. Oh. You know, I don't know. I wonder if I would be charitable in that situation, or if the worst of me would come out and I would be a bit insulting or jabbing. I hope I would be charitable. Let's see.
I'm not aware of anyone who thinks that Mary was Luke's primary source for his entire gospel. And it's pretty clear that actually that's not the case, because he used about 40% of Luke's gospel is actually based on Mark. But for the first two chapters of Luke's gospel, there are indications that he's getting these traditions from Mary. That doesn't mean he personally interviewed her. He may have done that, but we don't have what I would consider.
It must be so weird for Bart to be in a situation where he thinks that the Gospels are anonymous, that he thinks they're written way later. I've never heard him try to string the old tradition from Jesus to the first written Gospel. So a situation like this where I'm guessing in his mind the author is either lying or the implications that we get from him from the author are mistaken. You know, a forged situation, as his book would imply. And whether the misleading is intentional or unintentional, I don't even think matters. It just must be weird to get a question like this. Like, hey, the book implies by our reading that this is one of the sources. So doesn't that make it a great source? And then does Bart just go, I don't think that's who wrote it. I don't know. I don't know how you handle that.
Consider proof of that from the text. What we do have is Luke saying twice in the infancy narratives that Mary remembered these things about Jesus' early life in her heart. And the way I read that, Luke is telling us who his tradent is for this material, who his tradition bearer is. It's Mary. She experienced these things, she remembered them in her heart, and somehow Luke got that information. He may have got it by interviewing her personally, or he may have got it through someone else. He may have got it from a written document. And I've seen arguments that it may have been a written document based on various factors that are kind of complicated to go into here. But I think that that material is accurate. Bart, I think, likely disagrees to a significant extent, but I would say that that Luke 1 and 2 are based on memories that ultimately come from the Virgin Mary.
Thank you.
I'm really bothered that Bart won't answer any of these religious style questions. I really wish he would. I really wish he would. I really wish right there he had strung his theory on how it went from oral tradition to the anonymous writer or writers of Luke. It's a shame that he didn't do that.
I have to tell you, this will be the last question because we have to get to the concluding statements after this. So go ahead with your question for Dr. Erhman.
Make it a zinger.
Yeah, man.
Oh, man. Dr. Erhman, Jimmy, thank you for your service and sharing your perspectives for
Could you
everyone.
speak right into the microphone?
Yes. My question is...
Square dance caller tip.
Right. This has to do with Matthew, Mark, and Luke being the synoptic gospel, preparing for the kingdom of God to repent, while the Gospel of John brings the identity of Jesus. I wanted to ask specifically about the story of the woman anointing Jesus. The sinful woman anointing Jesus' feet. At the end of Luke 7, does Jesus' phrase saying your faith alone has saved you, go in peace, does that imply that, that the woman's faith in Jesus was that he's the Son of Man?
It's an interesting question. So it happens a lot in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that when somebody gets healed by Jesus, Jesus will say, your faith has healed you. And it's an interesting perspective because it means that the person's faith is what's generating the miracle. Like when the woman comes up and touches Jesus, she's been bleeding for 12 years, and she touches the hem of his garment, and he says, your faith has healed you. And so it does show that these Gospels do understand that Jesus is the one sent from God who has the power of God. That passage in Mark I just mentioned says he knew that the power drained out of him. And so it's a very interesting passage because it means that he's got power that's been given him that is drained out. So I think that these Gospels do in fact, think that Jesus has this power, but it doesn't make him the Son of Man as a technical term. The Son of Man, I agree with Jimmy that comes from Daniel chapter 7, and it refers to a cosmic judge of the earth who's coming to destroy the forces of evil. And I don't think it's directly connected with the healing miracles per se.
And for once, I'll shut up.
Another miracle.
I was going to say.
Hey, who do you think I am, Tim Staples?
All right, now it's time for each gentleman will get 5 minutes of a concluding statement. I promise you I will get the clock right on this one. Dr. Erhman, your concluding statement.
Well, thank you all very much. You've been very generous, and I appreciate it. A number of times I've given talks to large groups of Protestant evangelical fundamentalists, and they're usually nice too, but not as nice as you. I don't have a lot to say in conclusion. I want to say something about just kind of a broad overview of things that I think that the Gospels of the New Testament are best seen as documents of faith, not as historically accurate accounts of what actually
I agree.
happened in the life of Jesus. In the modern world, that seems kind of problematic, because we're so used to things like things having to happen in order to be right. So you watch a movie and you say, is this true? Is this a true story? And my kids used to ask me that. We'd watch a movie, they'd say, is this a true story? And I'd always say yes. Then they'd get that look in their eyes. They say, no. Did it happen? I said, no. There are a lot of things that are true that didn't happen. If you believe in the Gospels, it's not because you can prove they're historically accurate. I mean, that's not, faith isn't a matter of proving that they're accurate. You're listening to the stories that these authors have given you. And if you're a Christian, you believe they've been inspired to give you these stories. So you shouldn't make them into something that they're not. I think the differences in the Gospels are really important for all sorts of reasons, but one thing is that I think that in response to a question was given, I think these Gospel authors are changing things in order to communicate their particular message. And if you pretend they're saying that someone else is saying, then you're getting it wrong, but you're also ignoring the fact that in different situations, different times, different audiences, as somebody said, people have to phrase things in their new situation, in the new context that they're in. And so each gospel changes things according to his own perspective and what he feels God is leading him to say. That's significant because it doesn't relate just to the gospels. It relates to the entire Christian tradition. The context within which we all live changes. Our context is different for each of us, but also there are different historical differences between different Christian audiences. The message has to change because the context changes. And this isn't true just of the Gospels, it's true of everything you believe as a Christian. You are not living in the first century. You're not living in the days of Jesus. The message has changed. We have different views of things today than people had in the first century. We have different views of the relationship of men and women, for example. We have different understandings of sexual orientation. We have different understandings of why people have different sexual orientations. We have different understandings about gender identity than we used to have. Things change. The message has to change to accommodate what we think now. We don't live in the first century. We also don't live in the Middle Ages. And we don't live in at the time of the Reformation and the conflicts going on then. We don't live in the 1950s. The message has to change, or it's not actually being faithful to the gospel message. Because the point is that the gospel message is renewed every time that it's contexts. That's how everyone living in a tradition ought to treat their tradition. Thank you very much.
Anyone else notice that cut? That's weird. That's a weird cut.
Jimmy Akin.
Keynote? There we go. So I want to thank Bart for coming and having this exchange tonight. I've enjoyed it very much. I want to thank everybody else for coming as well. Tonight we've looked at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we've asked the question, are they fundamentally reliable or fundamentally unreliable? Well, in a debate, the person who agrees with the resolution has the burden of proof, and Bart agrees with the resolution, which was that the Gospels are unreliable, because turnabout is fair play for once. So Bart had to show that they're not reliable. I only have to show that he didn't prove that. Reliability is actually a spectrum, but it's a mistake to set the threshold of reliability at 100% because that makes it the same thing as inerrancy. And inerrancy is not the same thing as reliability. Without a time machine, there is no way to go back in history and evaluate every claim in the Gospels independently to verify it. So we can't say what percent of the time are they right. Instead, I've proposed that a source may be judged historically reliable if we can verify many of its major claims, many of its intermediate claims, and many of its lesser claims. And we're entitled to regard it as historically reliable until we've seen enough errors to counterbalance that. Now, in assessing those errors,
the problem is a really good liar will do the same thing. A really good liar will do a little bit of gaslighting, will take a little bit of what he knows about you, and he'll say big things that he knows are true, little things that he knows you know are true, and things that don't matter, the middle things, but that are also true. And then he weaves his lie in between, snakes it. That's the problem. The problem isn't the Gospels. The problem is human nature and trying to divorce the Gospels from human nature. Now, as religious people, we have the great joy of being able to say it's inspired by God. But as an atheist who doesn't believe in miracles or magic or what have you, I think it's impossible for the secular scholar to get to the same conclusion without those beliefs.
or proposed errors, we have to take into account ancient writing practices.
The Bible makes the learned look like fools and makes the foolish look wise. And the question is, are we being fools for God, or are we being fools for man?
Like selection, paraphrase, and sequencing. And those involve approximations. But different degrees of approximation do not amount to an error. Mr. Chekhov is right when he tells the captain we'll be at the planet in 2 hours, and Spock is right when he tells the captain we'll be at the planet in a few seconds ahead of 2 hours. Neither is wrong. They're just using different levels of approximation. It's a mistake to press the details of a gist account as if they are precise, because they're not. They are meant to be approximate and convey the essence of what happened. So what happens when we weigh things up? Well, Bart has proposed that there are some passages, he's named a few of them tonight, that he regards as places where the Gospels have errors in them. And we can grant that for the sake of a hypothetical argument. We could even double the number of errors that have been brought up tonight. If you want to do more research, go to jimmyakin.com/Bart. And check out Bart's books too, but go to jimmyakin.com/Bart and get both sides of the story. In terms of the evidence that's been presented tonight.
Please, Jimmy, do not do this with James White. Stop self-promoting. Stick to the argument. Win.
We've seen the Gospels vindicated on numerous major claims, intermediate claims, and lesser claims. And fundamentally, the proposed errors, even in expanded form, do not counterbalance all of the things that Bart himself has admitted the Gospels are probably right about. And so, I would assert that as nice a guy as he is, Bart hasn't met the burden of proof, and yes, the Gospels are historically reliable. I also want to say a special word, because Bart asked at the beginning about how many people here are Catholics and how many are here to see him get creamed, and it takes a lot of guts to do that. So I want to give a big round of applause to Bart Erhman. Thank you very much.
Bart Erhman and Jimmy Akin, ladies and gentlemen. Well done, gentlemen. Thank you. Chris?
Hey,
Chris,
can I
check.
talk? Sorry.
Okay. Okay. I'll work on the little speech for Sunday, for Sunday's video. Tomorrow's live stream, since we already did an open room earlier this week, tomorrow's live stream will not be an open room. It'll be on a different topic. I don't know what yet. There's a few things that I wanted to hit on. I've been wanting to do Buddhism and I haven't gotten a chance to. Maybe we'll do some Buddhism tomorrow. But I don't think Jimmy Akin did a good job. Tux has kind of pushed me a little bit on the line to... I'm going to go ahead and say that, yeah, to the lay Christian and Catholic eye, it looks like Jimmy Akin won. To my ear, Jimmy Akin lost, and I still think Bart presented better facts. I think Jimmy's playfulness and his stratagem detracted from the facts and from the data, and I think that's the problem with apologetics. And when I watched this video the first time, I had not identified that problem. I think that was rhetoric, and I think rhetoric is a lie in a sales pitch, and I don't trust that kind of rhetoric. So while Tux has helped convince me that, yes, in the eyes of Christians and Catholics who are lay people, who are not professional debaters, Jimmy Akin did an amazing job. But as someone who reads these books, who spends his hard-earned money on reading these books, not just the Catholic Answer books, not just Bart Ehrman's books, but a ton of theology, I think a close study of this debate shows the problem of rhetoric and the problem of apologetics. It is a lie to tell Protestants that what we mean by inerrancy is the same thing they mean. It is a lie. Jimmy Akin, after defining that it is reliable, then spent the rest of his conversation pulling back from that claim to explain that what we mean by reliable is that it's just the gist and that the gist isn't wrong. And while I agree with what Jimmy Akin said in his defense, I don't agree with his claim. I do believe the Bible is real. I do believe the Bible is true. I do believe the Bible is inspired. And I think a false defense, even if done for the sake of a victory on paper, is still false. I think Jimmy Akin should have presented the facts, should have presented what Catholics actually believe about these texts. He should have gone to the Vatican II statements. He should have gone to the traditions and statements of the Holy Fathers. Should have gone to dogma. He should have let it be a fight. And if he lost, fine. Because what he would have won is converts. And I think converts to the faith and the truth is something worth fighting for. And I think winning a debate on a technicality, on points, is unworthy of the cause that we are called to. And that's my problem with apologetics. You're pulling them in with a lie and hoping that, well, once they're in, they'll get the real truth and then they'll be saved. Except if they leave the faith because they figure out that it's a lie, you've done more than damage them, you've damned them. That's different than being mistaken and explaining something wrong. When you're knowingly manipulating them, I think it's wrong. Go back and watch Jimmy Akin speaking to Matt Fradd about this debate, and go back and watch Jimmy Akin speaking to Trent Horn as a debrief to this debate, and listen to him talk about his strategy. Well, I think Jimmy Akin is a great guy, and I do hope he gets to heaven, and I do pray for him. And he is one of the people that helped me convert into Catholicism when I wasn't a practicing Catholic, when I was a lapsed Catholic, when I was a Taoist. 7 years into apologetics and YouTube, and I can tell you that I do not appreciate this kind of debate tactic. And I think it was unfair to Bart Erhman. I think it's unfair to the audience. And I think it doesn't show the intelligence and abilities of Jimmy Akin. So it's unfair to himself as well. I hope this does not happen with James White, because James White will not fall for these tricks. James White knows Jimmy Akin very well and doesn't like Jimmy Akin at all, at least when it comes to debating in theology. Maybe in real life they're friends, but at least on air, James White does not appreciate Jimmy Akin. And I think this would be a mistake to use a strategy like this against James White. All right, please like and subscribe. I will be doing a video the night of the James White Jimmy Akin debate, even if I got to stay up late to do it. And tomorrow night we will probably be doing Buddhism, and Sunday I will have a video with my speech, what I think Jimmy Akin should have said for his opening statement.